Fox said, oh, it's liberal, and moderate Democrats said, oh, Fox said it's liberal, it must be liberal. We need something more moderate. I'm like, what? Like, I guess, like, the Green New Deal is the answer to the policy questions everyone's been asking, and just because the grooves of American political rhetoric are so deep, everybody's so in their lane that it just got flopped into a lane the minute it debuted. And I just, it's so frustrating to me that if Democrats, if rural Democrats from purple districts had, instead of just accepting what Fox said about the Green New Deal, had instead gone to their constituents and said, hey, farmers and out-of-work fossil fuel workers, here's a plan to infuse this area with federal money and to create new jobs for you and to get you better health care. This is directly materially good for you. Even if you don't give a crap about polar bears, or even if you don't give a crap about climate change, this is an economic redevelopment program. It was there waiting for the Democratic Party to unite around it. And if the Democratic Party was capable of uniting about anything, if it had any collective strategic sense, it would have united around it and not just let Fox define it. But there's no left Fox, so moderate Democrats are just in their offices in D.C. watching Fox to find out how to treat these things. And so it just ended up being unrealistic, lefty socialism, and we're just back to everybody saying the same shit they say about everything.
I think that, though, lets us get a layer too deeper into this sort of identities and ideas of war inside the climate movement, because, I don't know, I don't actually truly buy your recitation of that. I'm a fan of the Green New Deal. I think of it more as an ideology. It's sort of saying this is what it means to be a progressive in this era. But the Green New Deal encoded a huge number of ideas that were extremely uncontroversial as moderate Democrats. Right? Medicare for all is a very controversial idea in the Democratic Party. A job guarantee is a controversial idea in the Democratic Party for moderate Democrats. So when you put it all in one thing, what you're saying is that this is the agenda for the most liberal, ambitious side of the party that includes all things you guys don't like. I think that was the right thing to do. I'm not questioning that, but it's not. That was not a Fox thing. Fox did, as you always knew they would, demonize the Green New Deal. But why you didn't get that was not built for support for moderate Democrats. I could look at it in 2 seconds.
But Fox didn't demonize it. Fox didn't demonize what was in it. It's a threadbare resolution. But they made shit up. They could have made shit up about anything.
We all know that getting a good night's sleep is crucial to good health and well-being, but that can be a lot easier said than done this time of year. Holiday stress is way better night's sleep. There's also hundreds of sleep stories. Home.com/Ezra. You get 40% off a premium subscription that comes with unlimited access.
I recently wrapped up Land of the Giants, The Rise of Amazon. In this podcast, we examine how Jeff Bezos turned a small online bookseller into one of the most powerful companies. And we end the season by how we got here.
A real internal
here, and what the future might look like. The entire first season is out now. Find out more and binge it on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app.
There's a real internal war in climate politics, much more so than I understood, between, I don't know, I guess the terminology is right, the eco-modernists and, I guess the environmentalists or something. The Green New Deal, for instance, what was striking to me, even though, as you've made the point many times, it wasn't explicitly taken off the table, the fact that it did not mention nuclear, the degree to which nuclear has become a symbolic issue in the environmental space, where if you're for nuclear, that means you're for technology and for a future of more and energy abundance and so on, versus you're against nuclear and you're for a future of limits and learning to live in harmony with the planet and discipline and a human race that understands that it can't have everything and just grow forever. That's a really deep cleavage in a way that I didn't understand how deep it was. And the way that those have become identities that I think are going to be, even if Democrats were ready to put together a big program and so on, the degree to which those things are going to create internal splits in the caucus and in the sort of party seem to me to be underplayed. The ferocity of those debates is I think they just haven't come out that clearly to people who aren't paying that close attention because everything is overwhelmed by that bigger left-right Fox News, is it real, is it not debate. But inside, there's a lot more anger and much more different understandings of the situation than I had understood before I really began talking to people on both sides of that.
Yeah, well, you know the old parable about the blind man and the elephant. Everyone feels something slightly different. I mean, and climate change is so big and all-encompassing. Like, if you just approach it, like if you came down from Mars, right, with no priors, and just approached it cold, as it is, as the science says it is, your solutions and your responses would not necessarily line up neatly with political identities as they have formed in the U.S. Let's put it that way. Like, it crosses a lot of those. The policy response, or a sensible policy response, would cross a lot of those lines, cross a lot of those barriers, and would please and displease identities in various ways. But of course, like, no one is a Martian, no one's approaching it like that. It's so big. Everyone's coming to it from a place already, right? From an identity already. So, like, if you're an environmentalist, you've got all this set of assumptions about how the world works and how politics works and who's a good guy and who's a bad guy. And to some extent, you're going to squeeze climate change into those categories. It's the same thing, like whatever your priors are, wherever you're coming from, to a certain extent, you just can't take in climate change as it is. It's like the noumena, it's like you can't experience it directly. You have to sort of like squeeze it into some kind of categories to make any sense of it. And everybody has their own categories they squeeze it into, so you end up with a lot of these very, very stupid arguments. But I also think that to some extent you're right that there are deep divisions, but I tend to think that a lot of those, like, if we were in a rational world with a rational policy making apparatus, that people of goodwill on climate change could come to consensus, reasonable consensus, pretty quick. I think the heat of those debates has just been exacerbated and turned up continually by the fact that nothing is happening. There's nothing to talk about. No one's doing anything. There's no point in trying to persuade the right? So if you care about climate change and you have strong opinions on it, who will listen to you? Like, who cares about your arguments? It's the person a notch over, right? I mean, this is so true on the left on so many things. Like people who share 80-90% of their sort of policy prescriptions will fixate on that 10% and argue with one another because, like I said, liberals love arguing, they love persuasion, they love the idea of like working things out, and the only people who will argue with them are other people who are already on board with climate change. So you get these debates that I think just go on and on because there's nothing else to do. There's nothing else to talk about. So I think they've been sort of exaggerated historically by that dynamic also. And I think some of them are fading. Like a lot of these sort of, like the nuclear thing, I get why it seems much more intense than you thought. I guess I've been living with that intensity for longer, and I actually have started thinking that outside the kind of activist fringes, like there's like the eco-modernist elite thinkers and sort of like the traditional elite thinkers, and then there's kind of like that stuff filters down to the activists who kind of like take on a sloganeering version of it and go out and beat the drum for it. I think the drum beaters are still far apart, but the elites, I think, are getting closer and closer together, partially because the problem's so obviously bad that literally anything we do is better than nothing, and also because it just turns out that a lot of these technical disputes are resolvable. Like they are, like the dispute over nuclear is like there's no reason you have to be ideologically pro or anti-nuclear. It doesn't make any sense. Like that only makes sense in light of weird previous ideological commitments and identities having to do with other issues and other decades, right? It's the baggage of that stuff. If you just approach it cold, it's not that hard to find consensus. Of course we need to spend more money on nuclear. Of course we need to spend more money on everything. It's always both and, right? Like all these arguments ground out in both and. It's just there's no policymaking process to structure that consensus and put it on paper so the arguments just get rehearsed over and over again. But I think if we had people of goodwill sitting down to make policy, it would not actually be that difficult to make really good policy.
I mean,
what makes it difficult to make good
general thing, right?
Yeah.
Policy is positive sum and identities are zero sum.
Yes.
Like
yes.
There's
yes.
almost every policy you can sit down and figure out a way to make it a bit better for most people. And then it gets into, well, who's going to win? Like, who's going to win the election? Who's going to win the competition? And then people start getting very zero-sum about it. I mean, there's this, I think it's Charles Mann, right, who is the prophet-wizard dichotomy. You know, some people are prophets and some people are wizards. And, like, the prophets are sort of the, you know, the moralistic, like, it's all come down around us. We're courting disaster. We need to learn to live with less. And then the wizards are the technologists. We're just going to invent our way out. And I definitely, in that, probably fall on the wizard side of things, because I don't think that there's a politics of this that isn't going, like, either the technology makes these solutions cheap enough to implement, or, like, there's no version where the politics are going to work out. But by the same token, there's no version where the technology is going to be cheap enough to implement or deployable that the prophets haven't created that political will. So there's this way in which oftentimes things that seem from the outside to be opposed are actually clearly symbiotic. Like, you need the people who are creating the political will, who are creating the panic, who are creating the urgency and the prioritization, because you can invent everything you want. If there isn't interest or will or urgency around deploying it or putting in the research funding even to invent it, you're not going to get there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to summarize that is, like, all these internal disputes in the climate world, stepping back and viewing them from the perspective of the question of do something or don't do anything seem very small, right? They seem tiny compared to the much larger question of, like, should we, like, wake the hell up and do something about this? You know, it seems picayune. The only sort of thing I would caution or question in the way you just put that is, I feel like it reflects a little bit of an unspoken assumption that has crept into climate politics, where technology is one thing, it's like sort of positive and giving us better lives and solving these problems in, like, a positive way, and policy is negative and punitive and tries to solve the problem by taking stuff away from people and denying people stuff. And so, given that dichotomy, anyone who's lived with politics for a while is like, yeah, like, punitive's not going to be popular. It's probably not going to work. Like, people aren't going to get excited about that. Clearly, we should go the positive direction. But I feel like that's a bad, like, that's a bad way of looking at politics. Like, no technology develops de novo. No technology just arises out of, like, the genius of tech bros in San Francisco. It's all shaped from the various early stages by policy. Technology is policy. Like, we can shape technology results through policy, and if we want technology to get cheaper, as we absolutely should, we do that through policy. So again, it's like, this is not an either or, it's a both and. You might want to price carbon just as, like, a background accelerant to all this, but it's not going to be your main tool. Your main tool is going to be targeted sectoral policies to make low carbon technologies cheaper, and to spread them and to create the sort of, like, financing mechanisms and regulatory structures that enable them to spread quickly. You know, it's not, policy and technology are not different. And so, like, the kind of the prophets, this sort of, I get the, like, philosophical distinction, but in practice, as always, like, there's elements of both that will inevitably be involved. I kind of think, like, this is one of many areas where a distinction is sort of illuminating in some sense, but it also reflects something about climate change that comes up over and over again, which, like, people really don't like ambiguity. They really don't like complexity that refuses to resolve or take any sort of discernible shape. They don't like a morass of anxious, just, you know, like an anxious morass. So they tend to clarify things by saying, oh, like, we're gonna fall apart and humanity is doomed, because at least that's, like, aesthetically and dramatically a clear, you know, resolution solution to all this, and it's the same with, or no, we're going to like transcend and go to space, and this all of this will look like something silly we worried about once we invent the right tech. Just all these sort of stories and all these sort of extreme versions of policy are all kind of like groping for clarity and something clear and clean to hold on to, when in fact likely the outcome in climate policy and likely the outcome in climate change is like a really unsatisfying muddle of crap that like could be way better but also could be way worse.
I think that the most common mistake in policy debates is people who do policy always and everywhere underestimate muddling. They underestimate how much people will muddle through. They underestimate how much pain people will bear. In some ways, I think that the emphasis in the climate debate on ideas of extinction, uninhabitability, like a world that like people can't live in, is done to, like, one, I actually don't think the science really backs it up, at least not on the sort of, timetables that we can see forward into soon. But two, I think that it operates like it does in a lot of things. The healthcare debate has always been like this too, where it's like, everybody's like, well, we can just let costs keep going up, because if you do, then the line will go all the way to the top of the graph and there'll be no money for anything else. So obviously we're gonna, and then it just turns out they keep going up and we're like, okay. And it's bad. Like, really, people hurt and die and lose their homes, and I mean, it's bad. But people muddle through a lot of bad and always have. And I think that one of the things in the climate debate is that there's a desire for it to have to resolve, right? If it is true that in the next 30 years we're going to hit some point of no return and then Earth becomes uninhabitable, then it actually has to resolve. Like, either we're going to win or lose, when the reality, I think, is that we're going to muddle. And hopefully we muddle better than worse, but we're going to
There's
muddle.
a reason it ends up there. I mean, there's a reason it ends up there, which is just the intense complexity of all this, and the sort of and also one of the scariest things about David Wallace Wells, who I think you've also had on his book Uninhabitable Earth.
You had on.
Right, I had on.
You had on this podcast on his book.
Yes, I thought I remembered vaguely. Yes, I talked to David Wallace Wells, but his book is great. Everybody should read it. And one of the scariest things he raises is the extraordinary ability of human beings to adjust to circumstance, right? To adjust to what's around them. Like, we humans have shown the ability to adjust to, and even to be happy in, incredibly inclement circumstances, like you just incredibly harsh, horrific circumstances. And if you're just born into that, that's your normal. And we're so good at acclimating to things and just taking things on board that this narrative that's been around in climate circles for a long time, this notion that like once it gets bad enough, people will see, like you said, that we have to do something, right? That will finally bring that clarity, like this clarity of purpose that people desperately want. Once it gets bad enough, there's like, I don't know, 2 storms simultaneously, whatever, pick your disaster. People will wake up, but that all presumes that people sense a change and a difference. But like, what's going to happen is storms are just going to incrementally, very, very slowly get worse. Like, everything's getting sort of incrementally slowly worse, and every new cohort that's born into that thinks of that as normal. Like, there's not, the timescales are so screwed up here, there's not a sort of a single cohort in power that feels a change at the level of kind of human experience. So we just like are going to get used to each new increment of chaos, each new increment of suffering. The idea that like there will be regular heat waves that wipe out thousands of people at a time will just like will just be normal. Like, look how fast insanity became normal day-to-day operating procedure in the US post-Trump. Like, look what we've gotten used to, and how fast we've gotten used to it, and how hard it is already to sort of arouse ourselves at things that just a few years ago would have been cataclysmic in American politics, would have shaken us all to our core. I was thinking about this yesterday when they impeached the president. I was like, oh, the 3rd impeachment in U.S. history. This ought to feel big. This ought to feel like a big deal, but like my big deal-o-meter is completely broken by the last 3 years, and I just don't have it's just like I've been crouched taking this beating from from the world, and I just don't have the sensitivity anymore to even register it as a big deal. And that's true as climate gets worse and worse. It's just like we're just going to take it on board, and so there's not going to be this spontaneous upwelling of resistance. There's not going to be this sort of like moment, Pearl Harbor moment, where people finally and completely and decisively aim at this problem. It's always going to be difficult to drive it into political priorities, because it's always going to be in the background, and which is why, and this is a long winding way of saying this, is why I sort of like, I don't really personally, aesthetically, in terms of facts, I don't really like the extinction narrative either. I don't really like we only have 10 years left either. Like, in my perfect world, everybody's, cautiously saying, using all the right caveats and being precise about whatever. But it's just, climate change is never going to be that. There's never going to be a deadline. There's never going to be a clear reason why it has to jump to the head of the priority list. That's true no matter how bad it gets. There's always going to be proximate. I mean, even the problems that climate change partially causes are going to occlude climate change politically. Do you know what I mean? Like,
right, we have to deal with the refugee crisis,
migration, on and on. Like rescuing cities. Like, even that is going to make it more difficult to address the larger background problem. That's always going to be true. So this is sort of like my question to people who scold the Extinction Rebellion, or scold.
Starting route to 700 Grand Avenue. Head northwest on Indianola Avenue.
Or scold activists for saying we only have 10 years left, or scold any sort of like any attempt to give this some clarity, right, and some edges. They get scolded, but like the alternative is no one ever gets excited about it, and no one ever gets worked up about it, and it stays in the background, and we just deal with the proximate problems it causes forever and ever.
In 2.8 miles, turn left onto Grand Avenue.
Forever and ever, and it never gets better. So like, if the choice is being scientifically imprecise versus letting the world burn, you know what I mean? Like, maybe like our aesthetic and kind of like temperamental preferences for how people ought to talk, maybe we ought to reconsider those. You know what I mean? Like, maybe I should rethink about how I like people to talk, and maybe I should work backwards from what's going to cause people to solve this problem and prevent, apocalypse. Like,
yeah, I agree with.
It seems like it ought to be more important, right?
Oh yeah, I agree with a lot. I mean, look, like, it is important to me as a journalist that I am accurate in the way I talk about things, but I don't think it's my job in life to run around scolding people for being somewhat alarmist about the possible consequences of something that is incredibly alarming. I have to present good information, but activists are always more overheated. That said, something that I think really gets occluded in this debate and really does scare me, when you were saying we, right, like, we're just gonna let it. The problem of climate change, in some ways, I think the power of the, extinction level rhetoric, it's going to become a problem of inequality. Like, you can see this one coming. I think one thing that people in the extinction rhetoric are trying to do is say, you are not going to be exempted from this because you are rich and live in a rich country. And like, that's in Dave Wallace-Wells' book. He talks about the fires in Paradise, California, which is certainly had wealthy areas within it. Miami, I've read good pieces about beachfront real estate in Miami. And yet the truth of the matter is, if you're pretty rich, you're going to be more or less okay. Like for the foreseeable future, you'll be able to move away from Miami. You will be able to move away from places that are undergoing collapse. You will be able to have air conditioning during the heat wave. As far as we can see sort of into the near future, the rich are going to be able to escape a lot of the consequences of climate change. And the people who are going to pay are the people who did not cause this problem, number one. And the people who are the poor people in rich countries, right? Like, it wasn't the rich who suffered during Katrina in New Orleans. It was the poor in New Orleans, and then very much the poor in poor countries. Island nations that don't have the money for adaptation, or people living in low-lying areas of Bangladesh. And one of the things that scares me most about like the climate change future is it is this unbelievable accelerant. I don't want to say global inequality, because I don't mean something even as bloodless as inequality. Like, it is another way in which you are able to live a happy, healthy, prosperous, flourishing life if you are wealthy, and another way that you are exposed to early death, starvation, disease, pain, suffering, and also just like non-flourishing if you are not. And I'm all for trying to make sure that people in richer countries feel this is a problem for them too. And I don't believe there's some secret bunch of words that will unlock it. But my biggest fear in climate change is that what we have done or what we are about to do, is we are going to throw the world's poor back 100 years in human existence, to where they're much more exposed to constant natural disaster, and where they're in much worse kind of natural circumstances, while the wealthy, and I mean this sort of on the global level, but also within countries, the wealthy keep getting to accelerate into the future.
Just a few caveats. That's all absolutely right. And it's if you ask me, if my prediction, if I was a betting man, given how little we've done about inequality so far, and given how much it's already exacerbated, it doesn't seem like that's going to, it seems likely to continue, especially with all these things driving it. And I would just add, I would just say, by way of background, we don't really know how okay you will be if you're rich, because we don't really know how bad it's going to be.
In half a mile, turn left onto Grand Avenue.